Hey everybody, this is me back again, Mr. Harris, signing on. Today we're going to have a lengthy discussion about the developments of the Cold War in Asia, primarily speaking about the Korean War. Um, it is going to be very crucial that you are paying attention and that you kind of get the gist of what was going on here and the developments and the tensions that it caused between the Soviet Union and the United States and then other countries as well. All right, we'll see the involvement of China and sort of increase our sphere of influence also. So pay attention. Um, this may be the last time you hear from me for a while, so pay attention. All right, so when we talk about the Korean War and the Cold War tensions, it sort of began, of course, with North Korea army. They invaded South Korea. All right, and this was at first an attempt to reunite the country. All right, no one really thought, no, like the USA or the Soviet Union didn't really think that this was going to be a war that was going to be this important turning point in the Cold War. All right, that wasn't what the immediate reaction was. All right. So just to give you a little history about the Korea, Korea lost its independence in 1910 to Japan, and it actually remained a Japanese colony until 1945. All right. When Japan surrendered, the Soviet Union and the U.S. they had the troops. They moved, of course, respectively into the south and to the north part of Korea, and they temporarily drew this line at the 38th parallel. All right, and this was really an attempt to sort of deal with the Japanese troops that were there, um, and to sort of expel them. All right, the Cold War sort of began to develop in Europe. So of course, these are going to take on their own separate spheres. Of course, we have North, um, with the influence of Soviet Union, and then the South, of course, with the influence of the United States. All right. So the Soviet Union, they wanted unification of Korea, and they wanted their northern leader, of course, which is Kim Il Sung or Kim Song, and it withdrew its troops actually in 1948, and of course the U.S. wanted their leader Sigmund Rhee. All right. Now, no one really was too concerned with the immediate future of Korea. All right. Now, Dean Akinson is actually going to give a speech. He's going to become, he is the Secretary of State. Excuse me. And he calls this his defensive perimeter speech. All right. And he named the countries that the U.S. would automatically defend against the communist aggression. All right. And one of the key things to mention is that South Korea, of course, was not on this list. And um, mainland Asia sort of was out of the USA's Pacific defensive perimeter. All right. And this sort of, other world leaders like Stalin is sort of going to look at this like, really? All right. So that means that you're not really going to defend South Korea? Okay. Point taken. All right. So now we're going to look at this whole idea of the Soviet policy. How are they going to deal with this? Security reasons? Are they going to secure North Korea for security reasons? Or are they going to try to expand? All right. Now, of course, before the Korean War, there were border clashes, of course, between that 38th parallel. And you had the two rival states of North and South Korea. And just within the border clashes, over 100,000 Koreans died. All right, pretty significant. Now, the U.S. and Soviet troops are going to remain in their zones, and they're going to try to restrain the two leaders and the two sides from actually going to full-out war with each other. So they were really trying to keep the peace there. The whole idea of containing and keeping things where they are. All right. However, Soviet and U.S. troops are, going to leave. All right, 1948 and 49, and this is going to have what is known as like a destabilizing effect because the troops were there. They kept the peace and kind of helped, the Koreans and kind of get back to developing their own kind of government and economy. And the local government, they sort of became more aggressive. Now, Kim in North Korea, he warned Stalin and Mao in advance of his intention to attack South Korea. So he told them, I plan on doing this. All right. Stalin at first was like, all right, yeah, whatever, But after Atkinson's speech was like, this might be not be a bad idea. We're not going to actively get involved, but I'm going to give you a little support, just to kind of say it might be okay. All right. But Stalin did say, and this goes kind of gives you a little glimpse of the Soviets' kind of feeling towards the U.S. They didn't want a confrontation either. Not a military conflict, full out war. I mean, you're just leaving war. So they basically came to the conclusion that if the U.S. came involved, that the Soviet Union would not intervene or interfere at all. Okay? Now, of course, it was based on a lot of miscalculations, and it was sort of banking on the U.S. response. In his mind, the U.S. is not really going to do anything because South Korea is like off the radar. All right. Now, he did believe that it was necessary, unified, excuse me, Korea was necessary, um, and it would be beneficial if it was a communist government under Kim. All right, and it would strengthen sort of Soviet security. Um, so it kind of wanted that friendly state on the borders, and didn't. And of course, Soviet Union still felt like they didn't want to be encircled, so they wanted the sphere of influence of the east and the west of them, and they also saw the economic upside to it: hydroelectric power and raw materials. All right, that has sort of been denied by, of course, U.S. ally now, Japan. All right. Um, so it primarily was Kim, not Stalin in Soviet Union or Mao in China, who pushed for the attack in 1950. All right. Kim sort of believed that, oh, well, if I push for this unification, that many Koreans will see me as a national hero because I unified the country. Of course, Japan was very harsh in their treatment towards the Koreans, and Kim really did not like the way that the U.S. was sort of instilling their pro-West government in Japan and other regional powers, and he did kind of think that there would be assistance that would give to the South that, of course, would cause an issue. All right. Now, the U.S., of course, they wanted to contain communism. All right. But also, we know that Soviet influence in Europe was strong, and primarily the U.S., their main focus was Japan. They wanted to stabilize Japan and create and make Japan its ally in the Pacific, and able to combat any threat of attack or spread of communism. All right. So they wanted to sort of, like I said, tie them together to rebuild its economic strength. And of course, Japan was really defeated and damaged after the war, and the Communist Party of Japan was actually growing in popularity. So Congress is going to give money, $500 million in aid for Japanese, um, to fuel Japanese industry, all right, and with the raw materials and food, all right. So of course, China, South Korea, and Vietnam, they weren't seen on this defensive perimeter, and basically they decided that any threat of communism, it should actually just be contained in Asia. Now the Cold War is going to continue to develop, and the anti-communist forces in China and South Korea and so forth, they're going to be given, of course, financial aid to resist communists. All right, still operating under that whole economic plan that we talked about before, and it was actually those in Asia, these communist movements, that were more popular than in Europe. All right, because a lot of times in Asia, a lot of the Asian countries or nations, they desired independence from their colonial powers. All right, like the French in Indochina. Okay, so thus we see a lot of issues with this tied to a lot of national sentiments. All right. So, Truman's immediate reaction to the North Korean invasion on June 25th was actually to rush military supplies to South Korea. And, the Soviet Union was off boycotting the UN, and the U.S. is going to push this resolution through very quickly, and uh, which called for military action to be taken by UN members in North Korea. All right. So this was a UN military venture. All right. Under the pretense that we're going to there to sort of contain this whole idea of communism. All right. But it was primarily a U.S. venture. All right. And if you look at the number here, 260,000 out of just under 300,000 troops that were in Korea were American in South Korea. All right. So the UN forces and those in South Korea, they were placed under, of course, the leadership of U.S. General Douglas MacArthur. Now, U.S. response was sort of varied. All right. One of the things that many Americans believe was the fact that this was not just Kim and North Korea wanting to uh, take over South Korea. This was actually Stalin, using them as a puppet. All right. So this world domination, this whole theory that, communists trying to take over the world. All right, so Truman acted on what later became known as sort of the domino theory, and it's going to be that if one Asian nation failed, then it would cause this domino or chain reaction. But this actually gave widespread acceptance to that NSC 68, which we talked about, the National Security Council Agreement, all right, which had been drawn up, all right. So Truman believed that this was an important test for the United Nations. All right. So just the course of the war went on, and actually North Korea did really well. All right. They advanced into South Korea and captured the capital, which was at Seoul. And the U.S. actually stated that its mains were, while the U.S. was there, the troops were there was just to push the North Koreans out of South Korea across that 38th parallel. All right. But however, in 1950, Truman wanted to demonstrate how strong American felt about communism and his whole anti-communist beliefs, and he decided to invade North Korea. All right, that so really the Soviet Union or China, they really didn't want to intervene on behalf of the North Koreans. All right, so a lot of the U.S. coalition partners, all right, and they were concerned about this step that the U.S. was taking, all right, to go on the sort of offensive. And against this UN mandate, they moved beyond the policy of containment to what we call rollback, okay, trying to roll back this idea of communism or get rid of this communism or wipe it clean from where it exists. Um, that was actually outlined in NSC 68. Actually, to stop this whole containing and let's try to get rid of it. All right. So MacArthur, of course, under his direction, is going to capture North Korean capital. All right, and he's going to rush onto the Yalu River. Now, the Yalu River is on the Chinese border, so this is going to threaten Mao and the Chinese, and they're going to sort of send troops in because they felt that if the Americans captured North Korea, then they would move on into China. All right, so there you see it. That 38th parallel that we're talking about here, we have South Korea and then North Korea, all right, and then of course the Yalu River, which is sort of up here in northern Korea, all right, and this is sort of where we're talking about, all right, and of course here's Soviet Union and Russia, and they sort of kind of share a border with North Korea, all right, and then Japan is right here. So of course, hey, this is giving Russia a lot of communist sort of territory, so to speak, all right, and securing its borders. All right, so the course of the Korean War is still continuing on here. So a small force of Chinese volunteers are going to cross in October, and they're going to help stop MacArthur's advance, but they then go on to retreat. All right, and then MacArthur's going to renew his advance, and then over 250,000 Chinese troops are going to cross the Yalu River. And they're actually going to have a successful counteroffensive, and Chinese and North Korean forces, they recapture actual Seoul in 1951. They push south, and they retook the capital. All right. So Truman and then Akerson, Secretary of State, decided to go back to their original U.S. policy of simply just getting rid of the North Koreans out of the South. All right. But now the U.S. was actually committed to this war, to fighting in this war, to actually going back to his original message. All right. And of course, this was not supported by MacArthur. He publicly criticized Truman's policies publicly, and Truman is sort of going to replace him, get rid of him as military commander. Anytime you're outspoken against the president, that's like in his policies, then you're sort of going against, of course, the commander in chief and U.S. what the U.S. was standing for. All right. So the Republicans still supported MacArthur. They wanted them to sort of have this hardline approach to, this whole idea of rolling back communism. And there was a lot of public criticism to Truman's actions. All right. So Truman sort of stuck with this new policy. And then from March 1951, the two sides are sort of going to reach a stalemate. There's no clear victory or advance, and with many of the NSC 68's recommendations already being implemented, um, which they did develop the H bomb, which was part of that. The U.S. believed that the Soviet Union could be defeated. So many thought that, all right, well, we might as well just keep fighting and try to fledge this full-out war. But Eisenhower is going to become president, and he warned China that the U.S. would consider using the A-bomb if no progress was made during talks, peace talks. All right. So this was called this New Look foreign policy, and it was under the new Secretary of State, which was John Foster Dulles. And he's going to speak of this brinkmanship, being that we're willing and ready to use these nuclear weapons if we have to. Of course, this was more, just big talk than actual reality. All right, it really didn't veer from this whole policy of containment. It was just the fact that if we continue these fights and we can't come to an agreement, then we'll be ready to use nuclear force. But Stalin's going to die, and when he does, this is sort of going to cause unstable leadership in the Soviet Union for a little bit before a new leader comes along, and this is going to allow the armistice to be signed in July 1953. Now, of course, the agreement was that the line was spread across the 38th parallel and would be the border between North and South. And there were 3 years of fighting. Over 10 million were either dead or injured, and nothing had changed. So essentially, nothing changed with this conflict, but lots of lives were taken. All right. So what were the consequences of the Korean War? It's very important to note that. Of course, it gave all the people who were supportive of that NSC, or National Security Council 68, they gained this acceptance of this policy and this military implication. And this is also going to allow the U.S. to build up its military. All right. And they launched these new aggressive Cold War policies. And a lot of times the media people consider this to be the beginning of the arms race. All right. Because the Soviet Union is going to answer with their H-bomb. All right. Now, U.S. is really going to take the role of global policeman against communism. That simply means that they're now going to be like the major power that's sort of going to try to oversee a lot of the aspects of, type of governments and so forth and so on within the world. All right. Defense expenditure increased from 13.1 billion and by in 1950 to over $50 billion. So you see this huge increase in defense spending, which is actually directly attributed to that whole National Security Council 68. All right, that document. All right. So Korea was actually affected, and it sort of in 1951, the U.S., of course, with other 48 nations, they signed the San Francisco Peace Treaty with Japan, and that is going to actually go give sovereignty to Japan and end the U.S. occupation by 1952. And Japan is going to sign this mutual security agreement, which is going to allow U.S. to establish bases. All right. So the Korean War had an impact, of course, on NATO. It resulted in a lot of different security concerns with different nations. Australia and New Zealand, in addition, are going to be given this military alliance. All right. And of course, also the U.S. agrees to the military alliance with the Philippines. All right. So this ANZUS Pact, support against military aggression with Australia and New Zealand. And, of course, this is going to help lessen the threat of communism. All right? So, by the end of the Cold War, all of the proposals that were outlined in NSC 68 had actually been put into operation. Very important. Change of policy a little bit. Once again, U.S. is committed to this global war, and this is going to mean the cornerstone of this Cold War policy for over the next 20 years. There you have it.